On the day of her wedding, my daughter stood in the doorway, her dress catching the light of the afternoon sun, and said words that will never leave me. "You're not part of this new family." It was not shouted, not screamed. It was spoken quietly, but with the cold sharpness of a blade, slicing deeper than any anger could. Her hand rested on the door frame like a guard against me, as though the very wood could shield her new life from the shadow of my presence. I stood there, not as her father, not as the man who had carried her on his shoulders when she was too small to see parades, not as the one who stayed awake all night when fever burned through her skin. I stood there as if I were a stranger, denied entry not to a house, but to a bloodline. The silence after her words was unbearable. It was not the kind of silence that waits to be filled. It was final, sealing me outside her world. Behind her I could hear voices, laughter, clinking glasses, the bright hum of celebration that I was never meant to share. I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, the birthdays I paid for, the shoes I laced, the nights I walked home in rain just to put food on the table. All of it seemed invisible to her now. She did not just close a door. She closed a history, a bond, a fatherhood. I wanted to speak, to remind her of nights when she cried into my chest, of mornings when I left for work with empty pockets, but full promises. But the words wouldn't come. They would have sounded like begging, and I knew the battle was already lost. My daughter had chosen a new family, and in choosing, she had unchosen me. The doorway between us became more than wood and hinges. It was the border between blood and rejection, between memory and denial. I turned to leave, but my legs felt heavier than stone. Each step away from her house was a step into exile, and with every sound of laughter drifting from behind that closed door, the truth echoed louder in my chest. My daughter no longer saw me as her own. And in that moment, I realized this was not just a wound. It was a scar already carved into my life, one that would never fade. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments below, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your own life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with others. Your support helps us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. And now, let's continue. When the wedding invitations were sent, mine never came. At first I told myself it was an oversight, a mistake in the flurry of planning and details. I checked the mailbox every day, holding on to a thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, the envelope had been delayed. But deep down, I already knew. It wasn't that they forgot me. It was that I had been written out, deliberately, like a sentence scratched from a page. My name, my place, my role as a father had no seat in her new chapter. I heard about the invitations from others, neighbors whispering, a cousin who asked if I'd chosen my suit yet, a coworker who smiled and said, "Congratulations, you must be proud." And each time I forced a smile, nodded, swallowed hard, and carried the weight of silence on my shoulders. How could I admit the truth? That my own daughter had drawn a circle of family, and I stood outside of it like a stranger pressing my face against the glass. The day of the ceremony crept closer, and I noticed the way people spoke around me. Careful, hesitant, almost pitying. They knew. They all knew I hadn't been invited. Some offered kind words, but kindness felt like salt in the wound. I didn't want their pity. I wanted a place at my daughter's table, a chance to see her walk down the aisle, to witness the very moment her life was changing. Instead, I was left with nothing but silence, as if my years of fatherhood had evaporated into the air, meaningless to her new story. I sat alone in my small kitchen, the walls echoing with the absence of her laughter. On the table before me lay an old photograph, her 7th birthday, frosting smeared on her cheeks as she leaned across the cake toward me, eyes bright with joy. Back then, I was her whole world. Back then, there was no circle to keep me out. Now, that same child had grown into a woman who had built a new world, and locked me out of it without hesitation. It was not forgetfulness, it was exile. She hadn't lost my address. She hadn't misplaced my name. She had chosen silence, chosen distance, chosen to erase me from the story of her new beginning. And that realization burned deeper than any insult. It told me I was no longer her father in her eyes. I was just a reminder of a life she wanted to leave behind. And so the invitations came and went, passing through the hands of neighbors, friends, cousins, but never mine. And I learned that being uninvited is not just the absence of paper. It is the tearing out of a father's place, leaving behind a hollow where love once stood. I sat alone in my small kitchen, staring at the wooden chair across from me. It was hers once, when she was little. The place where she'd swing her legs back and forth, too short to reach the floor, her laughter spilling out like music. I could still see the faint scratch marks on its surface, carved by her restless fingers as she waited for breakfast or tugged impatiently at her homework. That chair had held her through stories, through spilled milk, through tears wiped away with calloused hands. Now it sat in silence, a relic of belonging that no longer belonged to me. The chair seemed to mock me with its emptiness. It had once been filled with life, with the sound of her voice calling me Dad, with questions about the world and pleas for one more bedtime story. Now it stood as proof that those days were gone, that I had been pushed to the edge of her life like an old photograph tucked in a forgotten drawer. The wood creaked faintly when I shifted my gaze, as if it remembered the weight of her small body, even if she no longer remembered the weight of my love. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the stillness, and set it down across from the chair as though waiting for her to join me. The gesture was foolish, but I couldn't stop myself. It was the ritual of a man clinging to shadows. The cup sat untouched, a mirror of the distance between us, my offering of presents to someone who had erased me. The walls of the kitchen carried the echoes of her childhood. The first time she recited her school lines aloud, the mornings she complained about oatmeal, the evenings when she sat at that very chair, whispering secrets she thought no one else could hear. And yet, all those moments that lived so vividly inside these walls seemed to mean nothing to her now. They were mine alone, memories that could not bridge the silence she had chosen. I leaned back and let my eyes close, but the emptiness remained heavier than stone. That chair was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a reminder, sharp and undeniable, that my place in her life had been taken away. It was the absence of her presence, the hollow of rejection made visible. And as I sat there, staring at it, I realized the truth I could not escape. Once, I had been her world. Now, I was nothing more than a ghost in her story. The pictures on the wall told the story of birthdays, graduations, and first days of school. They hung in neat rows, framed with care, each one carrying a piece of a life I had once built with my own hands. There was her 5th birthday, her cheeks round with joy as she reached for the doll I had worked extra shifts to buy. There was the first day of school, her hair tied with ribbons, her backpack too large for her small shoulders, her eyes looking back at me for reassurance. There was the graduation photo, the cap slightly crooked, my arm around her as if the whole world had been conquered in that single moment. Each photograph was more than an image. It was proof that I had been there. Proof that I had carried her through years that were not always easy. Proof that I mattered. But now, in her new life, it was as if these moments had been erased, rewritten to exclude me. In her wedding album, my face would not appear. In her new home, my name would not be spoken. The chapters we lived together had been edited, cut down until I was nothing more than a shadow she refused to acknowledge. And the cruelest part was that these pictures, hanging in my kitchen, were the last fragments of belonging I still held. To anyone else, they were memories of joy. To me, they had become wounds that would not close. I stood before the wall, my fingers brushing lightly over the glass, tracing the outlines of a life that had slipped from my grasp. The photographs glared back at me with a truth too painful to deny. I had given her everything I had, but in the end, I was the piece she had chosen to discard. The laughter frozen in those frames belonged to a child who once needed me, a child who once reached for my hand. That child was gone, and in her place was a woman who had built a new family without me, as though I had never been part of her story at all. The more I looked, the heavier the air became. What once filled me with pride now filled me with grief. These images weren't just memories anymore, they were reminders of betrayal, silent witnesses to a love that had been replaced, rewritten, and forgotten. And as I turned away, I felt the crushing weight of a truth I could no longer avoid. The past was all I had left, and even it had been twisted into something that no longer belonged to me. Family gatherings happened without a word to me. I used to know the rhythm of them, the smell of food drifting from the kitchen, the buzz of voices rising and falling, the sound of children's footsteps echoing through the hallways. Now, all of it passed without me, like seasons I was no longer part of. My phone stayed quiet, a silent slab of glass that never lit up with her name, never carried her voice across the distance. But my heart did not stay quiet. It echoed with the hollow sound of her absence, the kind of silence that deafens more than any noise. I imagined the table where they all gathered, plates passed around, laughter spilling over stories I would never hear. My chair, the one that had always been waiting for me, was gone. Not moved, not filled by someone else. Simply gone, erased from the arrangement of family. It was as though my existence had been carefully cut out, leaving no trace that I had ever belonged. The quiet evenings in my home grew heavier. Holidays arrived like intruders, pressing against me with their reminders of what I had lost. Once she used to call me first on Christmas morning, her voice trembling with excitement as she tore open her gifts. Once she used to ask me what I wanted for my birthday, as though my happiness was as important as hers. Now the date slipped by unmarked, unmentioned, as if time itself had conspired to erase me from her calendar. Blood had bound us once, my blood that had given her life, my hands that had carried her through fevers and fears, my sacrifices etched into every year she grew. But blood was silent now. It spoke nothing on her lips, it carried no warmth in her heart. The bond I thought unbreakable had become invisible, like a river diverted until it no longer touched the land it once nourished. I sat in that silence, aching, listening to the echo of what once was. It was not just rejection I felt, it was erasure. To her new family, I was not father, not even memory. I was absence. And nothing screams louder than being forgotten by the very life you created. The church bells rang one Sunday morning, their sound carrying through the air like a cruel reminder of what I was no longer part of. I had heard whispers from the neighbors days before, soft voices heavy with pity, words spoken just loud enough to confirm what I already knew. The ceremony had come, and I was not invited. The bells were not a call for me. They were a summons for others, for those deemed worthy of standing in the circle of her new life. I walked past the churchyard, slowly, deliberately, though every step felt like a weight pulling me deeper into the earth. Children laughed, women adjusted their dresses, men straightened their ties, and I passed among them, unseen, unheard, like a shadow, moving through the brightness of their mourning. From the road I could see the entrance of the church, draped in flowers, white ribbons fluttering in the breeze. I remembered when she was a child, collecting daisies in the field, weaving them into crowns, running back to me with her hair tangled by the wind. I would kneel down, fix the uneven ring of flowers on her head, and tell her she looked like a queen. Now she wore a crown of roses, but I was not there to see it. The doorway of the church that should have been open to me was nothing more than a barricade, a threshold I would never cross. The laughter of guests spilled out like sunlight, but to me it was a wound, each sound cutting deeper. I lingered on the edge of the crowd, not daring to draw attention, afraid of the shame that would come if someone asked why I wasn't inside. My own daughter had placed me on the outside of her happiness, and I carried that truth like a stone pressed into my chest. I turned my gaze upward, toward the cross that stood at the top of the church. I had once taught her to bow her head before it, had once held her small hands together in prayer. Now she prayed beneath its shadow without me, as though faith itself could be rewritten to exclude the man who had first whispered its words into her ears. The bells kept ringing, their sound echoing long after I walked away. Each toll reminded me of the life being sealed inside that building, a life I had no place in. I did not miss the invitation. It was never meant for me. She had written me out, and the world was content to celebrate her joy without questioning my absence. And so I left, not as a father, not as a guest, but as a ghost passing through the streets, unseen, unheard, carrying with me the unbearable weight of a truth no one dared to say aloud. She had chosen her happiness, and it no longer included me. At the reception, they raised their glasses high, their voices filled with joy, and the word family echoed again and again like a hymn. I was not there to hear it in person, but the whispers carried back to me, neighbors recounting the toasts, the blessings, the laughter. My name, the name that had once been the first word on her lips, was never spoken. They celebrated unity, love, and beginnings, but the blood that tied her to me, the years I gave away piece by piece so she could stand in that moment, were erased as if they had never existed. I could picture it too clearly. Her new family seated around tables draped in white, glasses clinking, candles flickering, her smile shining like a promise. Yet every promise was built on a foundation she refused to acknowledge. The nights I stayed awake working double shifts, the mornings I went without so she could have enough, the sacrifices I made that no one ever applauded. They toasted to family, but their definition excluded the man who had carried her through every storm of her childhood. There is a cruelty in omission that cuts deeper than hatred. Hatred, at least, admits your presence. Silence erases it. In that room, among those tables, my daughter stood as if she had sprung from nowhere, as if she had no father, no roots, no bloodline beyond what she chose to display. They saw her beauty, her happiness, her future, and yet none of them saw the man who had given her the strength to arrive there. I imagined her lifting her glass, thanking her husband, her in-laws, her new family, smiling with pride as she said those words. And I imagined my name sitting unspoken on her tongue, heavy but unwanted, waiting to be pushed aside. To be absent from a moment is painful enough, but to be erased from it entirely, to know that your story has been rewritten without you, is a wound that festers in silence. My blood runs in her veins. My years were poured into her life. My sacrifices built the foundation she now walks upon with such confidence. But in that hall, in that moment, my existence had no place. My name was not spoken, and so I was not there, not just in body, but in memory, in acknowledgement, in truth. It is a strange thing to feel your life vanish while you are still living. That night, as they toasted family, I understood that in her story I had been reduced to nothing more than a shadow, a name never called, a man never seen, a father unclaimed. Weeks later, I walked into the church, my steps slow, uncertain, as though each one carried the weight of all the doors that had been closed in my face. I chose a place at the very back, far from the polished pews where families sat pressed close together. I wanted no attention, no eyes turned toward me, no whispers about the father who had been forgotten. I only wanted the comfort of silence, the shelter of the cross above, a place where even a man cast out by his own blood might still find refuge. I bowed my head, my hands trembling slightly as I folded them, hoping to dissolve into the shadows, to become invisible in the crowd of bowed heads and folded prayers. But then the pastor looked up. His voice paused in the middle of a verse, his eyes sweeping over the congregation, moving past the families in their Sunday clothes, past the proud parents holding the hands of their children. His gaze kept searching, as if looking for something, or someone. And then it found me. For a moment I wished it hadn't. I wished he had let me remain hidden, tucked away in the back row, a man forgotten not only by his daughter, but by the world. But his eyes held me, and in them I saw not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. It was a recognition that pierced deeper than any rejection I had endured. In that one glance, he seemed to see more than the weary lines of my face. He saw the years behind them, the sacrifices, the storms weathered, the quiet dignity of a man who had given and lost more than anyone in that room could guess. The pastor did not lower his gaze. Instead, he held it, steady and unwavering, as though to remind me that even if the world erased my name, heaven had not. My heart pounded against my chest, a rhythm of pain and gratitude colliding all at once. I had entered that church expecting only silence, anonymity, a corner to sit in unnoticed. Yet in the pastor's gaze I felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It was as though he was telling me without words, "You still matter. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten." I lowered my head again, but the weight in my chest had shifted. It was no longer the crushing heaviness of rejection, but the fragile, trembling weight of hope. For the first time since my daughter's words at the doorway, I felt that perhaps justice had not abandoned me completely. Somewhere, in the quiet dignity of that gaze, was the promise that truth would not stay buried forever. In front of the entire congregation, he spoke my name. It was not just a sound, not just a formality. It was a recognition, a calling back to life, the part of me that had been buried under rejection. The pastor's voice carried with it a weight that filled the sanctuary, each syllable landing with quiet authority, erasing the distance I had tried to shrink into at the back of the church. He did not speak it as though I were a stranger or a visitor passing through. He spoke it as though it belonged there, as though it had always belonged there, tied inseparably to the walls, the rafters, the very heartbeat of the congregation. And in that moment I was not invisible. I was a father. The silence that followed was heavy. But it was no longer the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of recognition, of people turning in their pews, eyes shifting toward me. Some faces softened with surprise, others with guilt, a few with the dawning realization that they had sat at my daughter's table and toasted family without ever questioning my absence. And there she was, my daughter, frozen in the front row, her shoulders tightening, her eyes locked forward, but her face pale. The sound of my name, spoken publicly, left her no place to hide. I felt every heartbeat echo like thunder in my chest. For so long I had been erased, cut out of her story, left to haunt the margins of her new life. But in one voice, in one deliberate naming, I was restored, not by her, not by those who had chosen silence, but by a truth too large for her to contain. The pastor hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't whispered it discreetly. He had spoken my name aloud, in a place where every word carries the weight of witness, and no one could take it back. For me, it was not pride I felt, nor revenge, but something deeper. Justice. Quiet, steady, undeniable justice. My daughter's face told me she knew it too. She had frozen because she understood that the silence she had built around me had been broken, shattered by a truth she could not silence. Her attempts to erase me had failed, because now, in front of all, my existence had been spoken into permanence. I bowed my head, tears blurring my vision, but my shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. For the first time since that doorway, since those words that cut me to pieces, I was not outside the circle. My name had been called, and with it, a part of me had been brought back from exile. The pastor's voice did not stop at my name. He let it linger in the air, and then, as if the walls themselves had been waiting, he began to tell a story. Not a sermon from Scripture, not a parable from the past, but a memory drawn from the very bones of the church. He spoke of a winter years ago, when storms tore holes in the roof, when the rain poured into the sanctuary, and the congregation feared they would lose the only place they had to gather. He told of a man who arrived quietly, without announcement, carrying lumber on his back, climbing ladders alone in the freezing wind, his hands raw from work, his clothes soaked through with rain. He told of a man who labored not for praise, not for payment, but because he believed this church was home to everyone, a refuge that must be saved. And as he spoke, heads turned again, eyes shifting toward me. The story was no mystery. It was mine. Those long nights came back to me in flashes. The sting of cold rain on my face, the ache in my spine as I lifted beam after beam, the exhaustion that nearly broke me as I hammered nails by lantern light when no one else could afford to hire help. I had given everything I had, not because anyone asked, but because I knew what it meant for a community to lose its shelter. I had asked for nothing in return, not a mention, not a plaque, not even a thank you. I had only wanted the church to stand strong for the children, for the families, for the generations yet to come, including hers. Now the pastor spoke it aloud, and the silence in the sanctuary grew thick, almost trembling. I saw the shock in the faces of those who had toasted family at her wedding but had never spoken my name. I saw the shame flicker across the expressions of those who had accepted my absence as if it were natural. And then I looked at her. My daughter sat rigid, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap, her face a mask that could not hide the truth. She knew the story was mine, and now everyone else knew it too. The pastor's words rolled on, not with drama, but with quiet reverence, each sentence pressing deeper into the hearts of those listening. That man, he said, gave without asking. He built so others could worship. He sacrificed so others could be sheltered. He never asked for his name to be remembered, but it deserves to be. His gaze rested on me again, steady, unshaken. That man is here with us today. I felt my chest tighten, not with pride, but with the ache of being seen after so long, invisible. Tears burned my eyes as the weight of years lifted, not completely, but enough for me to breathe again. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was not erased. My legacy had been spoken into the air where no silence could smother it. And even if my daughter never called me father again, justice had already spoken louder than her rejection ever could. Whispers ran through the pews like a tide that could not be held back. At first it was just a murmur, a ripple of surprise, but then it grew. Low voices trading glances, eyes shifting in my direction, faces softening as truth cut through the silence my daughter had tried to build around me. My daughter's new family, proud and polished in their pressed clothes and practiced smiles, began to look at me differently. They had only known me as the man left off the invitation list, the father not present, the figure spoken of in silence. But now, in the open air of the sanctuary, they were forced to see me as I truly was, not the outsider she had painted me to be, but the builder of the very place where they bowed their heads in worship. I saw it in their eyes, the unease of realizing that every prayer they had whispered beneath that roof had been shielded by the labor of my hands. Every hymn they had sung had echoed against walls I had carried piece by piece, beam by beam. The church they treated as holy ground was a place I had bled for, sweated for, given myself to, when no one else could. And suddenly their certainty faltered. I was no longer just the man she had chosen to erase. I was the man whose unseen sacrifice had made their celebration of faith possible. My daughter sat frozen, her smile gone, her hands stiff as if bound by chains no one else could see. She had built a new life on silence, on the careful cutting out of my name. But now truth filled the room like sunlight pouring through stained glass, exposing everything. The family she had woven around herself shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between her and me, as though trying to reconcile the image she had given them with the one the pastor had just revealed. And I sat there, not rising, not speaking, not demanding. I did not need to. The truth was speaking for me now. For years, I had carried the weight of being invisible, of being erased from her story. But in that moment, I understood something deeper. Invisibility cannot survive when truth is placed in the open. My silence had been heavy, but their silence now was heavier, for it carried shame. I wasn't the stranger she had tried to make me. I wasn't the absent man they had imagined. I was the father who had built with his hands what they had come to worship within, and no one, not her, not her new family, not the walls of silence, could take that away. She couldn't meet my gaze. Her eyes, which once ran to me in trust when she was a child, now stayed fixed on the hymnal in her lap, though the pages did not move beneath her fingers. It was as if she believed that if she looked down long enough, the truth filling the room might pass over her, sparing her from its weight. But truth does not pass by. It lingers, it presses, it demands to be seen. And in that silence, her words, "You're not part of this family," echoed back to her, sounding brittle now, as though they had been spoken against stone, shattering on impact. I watched her shoulders tighten, her hands tremble ever so slightly, and I knew she was remembering. She was remembering the doorway where she cast me out, the wedding where my name had been erased, the toasts where I was not spoken of, the circle of her life drawn so carefully to exclude me. But now that circle had cracked, split open by a single gaze from the pastor, by a single story of sacrifice that could not be denied. Her rejection no longer stood strong. It looked fragile, almost pitiful, against the weight of truth. Her new family shifted uneasily beside her, uncertain of what to say, their polished confidence unraveling in the presence of my silent dignity. They had believed her story, accepted her version of me as absence, as shadow. But shadows do not build roofs. Shadows do not carry lumber through storms. Shadows do not give without asking. A shadow could never have left the mark I had left on the very place where they worshipped, and now they knew it. Still I did not rise. I did not speak. I only sat, my gaze steady, my silence no longer heavy with defeat, but filled with the quiet power of someone who does not need to fight to be seen. For the first time I felt the shift, the weight no longer pressing on me, but pressing on her. The silence she had tried to force upon me had turned on her instead. And though she would not look at me, though her eyes remained lowered, I knew she felt it. She felt the truth pressing down, undeniable, inescapable. She had tried to build her life on rejection, but rejection cannot stand when justice has been spoken into the open. And no matter how low she bowed her head, she could not hide from it anymore. I didn't need to stand or shout. I didn't need to defend myself with arguments or raise my voice above the crowd. My justice had already arrived, carried not on the wings of thunder, but in the softest, simplest form. My name spoken in truth by a voice they all respected. The pastor's words had done what years of silence could not. They had placed me back where I belonged, not on the margins, not in the shadows, but in the very heart of the story from which I had been erased. It was not revenge that filled me, not triumph or pride, but something deeper, dignity. A dignity so steady that it did not need applause, so unshakable that it could not be stolen again. The congregation shifted in their seats. The whispers subsided into a heavy hush, and I felt it, the weight of recognition settling in the room. It was not loud, but it was undeniable. Justice does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it enters quietly, laying its hand on your shoulder, reminding you that truth will outlast every lie, every betrayal, every silence. My daughter's words, "You're not part of this family," crumbled against that truth. She could no longer deny what everyone had just heard, what everyone had just seen. She could not erase the labor of my hands, the sacrifices of my years, the legacy of a father who had given more than he ever received. I felt no need to look around to confirm it. I did not seek out the faces of those who had once pitied me, or those who had ignored my absence. I did not search for her lowered eyes or her family's unease. I simply sat still, breathing in the air of quiet justice. For the first time in a long time, the silence was no longer mine to carry. It belonged to them, the ones who had believed I was nothing, the ones who had built their comfort on my exclusion. And in that moment, I understood something profound. Justice doesn't always roar. It doesn't always demand an audience or a battle. Sometimes, justice is simply the truth spoken aloud in a place where lies once lived. Sometimes, it is the quiet recognition that no one can undo, no one can silence, no one can erase. My justice was not a scene of triumph. It was a moment of peace, a restoration that needed no applause. My name had been spoken, and with it my place restored, and that was enough. I walked out of the church, not with bitterness, but with a dignity that no rejection could take away. The air outside was cool against my face, the bells still faintly echoing behind me. But for the first time in years, I did not feel like a man cast out. My steps were steady, not hurried, not bowed down by shame. I hadn't forced my place that morning. I hadn't begged for recognition or clawed for what was mine. I had simply sat in silence while truth, at last, spoke louder than every attempt to erase me. My place had been earned long before, earned in sweat on ladders, in nights of labor when others slept, in sacrifices that no one applauded, but that could never be undone. I thought of the years I had carried her on my shoulders, the storms I had shielded her from, the nights I had walked home with empty pockets but a fierce determination to provide. Those years had never been erased, no matter how hard she tried to silence them. They lived in me, in the bones of the church I had repaired, in the roof that still stood over the congregation, in the stories the pastor now refused to let die, and they lived in her, whether she acknowledged them or not. She could lower her eyes, she could choose silence, she could surround herself with a new family, but she could not cut me from the foundation of her life. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized I carried nothing bitter with me. The wound of rejection was still there, but it no longer bled. It had hardened into a scar that no longer weakened me, but testified to what I had endured. The justice I had received was not loud, but it was enough. My name had been restored where it mattered most. Not in the speeches at her wedding, not in the toasts of her new family, but in the recognition of truth that could not be denied. I walked down the steps with my head held higher than it had been in years. For once, I did not feel invisible. I felt like a man whose worth had finally been spoken into the air, where no one could take it back. My daughter might never claim me again, but she could never erase me. And that knowledge filled me with a quiet strength, a dignity that would walk with me long after the church doors closed. When he left the pulpit that day, the pastor's words did not fade. They lingered in the air like incense, heavier and longer than her silence ever could. Silence fades, it withers into nothing, but words of truth endure. They take root in hearts, they press into memory, they become part of the very air a place breathes. My daughter's silence had tried to bury me, to reduce me to a man forgotten, but the pastor's voice had carved me back into stone. Not in the fragile speeches of a wedding toast, not in the shallow applause of guests who barely knew my name, but in something far stronger, in the beams that held up the roof, in the nails hammered through my hands into the bones of the church, in the walls that had kept out the storm. My legacy was not written on invitations. It was built into foundations, and foundations cannot be erased. I walked away that morning knowing something had shifted forever. She could go on pretending. She could close doors, lower her eyes, surround herself with people who only knew part of her story. But truth has a way of standing taller than lies. Every time she sat in that church, she would see the roof above her and remember the hands that placed it there. Every hymn would echo against the walls I had carried into place. Every prayer she whispered would be sheltered by my labor, by my sacrifice, by the love she once tried to silence. She could deny my name with her lips, but she could not deny the shelter of my work over her head. And that is where justice lives. Not always in applause, not always in reconciliation, not always in the sweet words of forgiveness spoken aloud. Sometimes justice lives in what cannot be torn down. It lives in the memory of beams lifted in storms, in the sweat soaked into wood, in the invisible marks of sacrifice that outlast every attempt at erasure. She may never call me father again. She may choose silence until her last breath, but she cannot undo the truth that her life was built on the back of mine. She cannot erase the foundation I gave her. As I reached the edge of the churchyard and looked back one final time, the morning light fell across the roof I had once mended. It stood firm, unshaken, sheltering those inside who would never again believe I was no one. My name did not need to be carved on plaques or etched into glass. It was already written, forever, in the strength of what I had built, and in the voice that had spoken it aloud for all to hear. And so I walked on, not bitter, not broken, but whole. The world may have tried to silence me, but the truth had already outlived the silence. My daughter's rejection was loud for a season. My legacy would be louder for a lifetime. And though she tried to erase me, justice had already written me into the foundation of her life, a story that no silence could ever destroy.